Hi, I'm Helen from the Writing Development Centre. How do you structure an essay? It's probably one of the most common questions we're asked at the WDC. The simplest answer is that every essay has an introduction, a middle bit, and a conclusion. But you knew that already. The more complex answer is that it depends on the kind of essay that you're writing. Different kinds of essay question demand different types of structure. So let's have a look at some of the most common ones. There are some common organising principles that every essay shares. These are underlying patterns characteristic of academic writing, which your reader expects and will recognise, even if they aren't aware of it. Just as fairy tales have a characteristic structure which feels wrong if it's changed, so do academic texts. For example, if a story starts, "Once upon a time there were 3 princes," you know without being told that the first and second prince will fail on their quest and the youngest will succeed. If there's only 2 princes and it's the first one who rescues the princess, it doesn't feel right. Likewise, the narrative structures in academic writing move in predictable patterns, from things that we know to things that we don't know, broad topics to a more narrow focus, general observations to more specific conclusions, abstract ideas to concrete examples, and theory to practice, important to less important, and descriptive to analytical. If your essay begins with your least important points to get them out of the way, your reader might be confused. If you start with specific examples and detail before moving on to more general abstract theories, they're puzzled. This isn't a rigid rule, and you can break it, but be aware that you'll need to explain what you're doing explicitly to the reader. These patterns work at the level of the whole essay, and also at the level of paragraphs and even sentences. So what are the different types of question that you might encounter? There are 3 main types. Closed questions are ones which point you towards 2 or 3 predetermined options. For example, a question which asks, "Is essay structure important?" forces you to answer yes or no, or maybe. A question which asks, "To what extent is essay structure important?" forces you to answer to a large extent, to a small extent, or to some extent. Open questions, on the other hand, leave the scope of the answer up to you. The question, "Why is essay structure important?" asks you to list reasons, but which reasons and how many is up to you. "How do you structure an essay?" likewise demands a list of ways, but again, it's up to you which ones. Some questions, though, aren't questions at all. They're instructions like explain or discuss. These are even more open as to how you interpret them, but you could see them as implicit questions. Explain, after all, is just another way to ask why or how. Discuss means, what do you think of this? These different types of question assume different types of answer and therefore different structures in order to reach them. Let's think about some of the most common ones. Should critical thinking be taught in the workplace? Yes or no? This is a straightforward closed question. These are also closed questions, though less obviously. A quote discuss question asks you if you agree, to what extent you agree. What kind of structure might suit this kind of question? Well, let's think in terms of the overall shape rather than the specific content, and I'm going to use diagrams rather than words to illustrate this. So for a classic closed question, the structure shape that fits best is a classic 2-parter, for and against. This is the structure most commonly associated with essays, although actually most questions at university aren't closed questions, as they can be too simplistic for the more complex thinking that you need to do. Things aren't usually that black and white. The 2 halves don't have to be equal. You don't have to have 3 reasons for and 3 reasons against. It's up to you which side you think is stronger. And you can also choose whether you start with the reasons for or the reasons against, the weaker case or the stronger case first, before resolving it in the conclusion. This structure can also work on a micro level, that of paragraphs or sections as well as whole essays, but it doesn't suit all essay types. And trying to force an essay into this structure when it doesn't fit is going to be frustrating for you and the reader. Let's look at another common type of essay question, a mix of open and closed this time. Compare and contrast two things, in this case, higher education and the workplace, in terms of the role of critical thinking. Well, this isn't phrased as a question, but the implied question is, in terms of critical thinking, how are these two contexts the same and how are they different? That's the open part. So, are they more similar or more different in this respect? And that's the closed part. Compare and contrast questions can be really tricky to structure and lead you in circles. So let's look at some ways in which you could structure them. The first possible approach is simply to look at all the ways in which the two things are similar in the first half and all the ways in which they're different in the second half. In this case, there are more ways in which they're different, so there's your overall answer. This is the most straightforward approach, but it depends on your word count. In describing all of these different ways in which they're the same and different, you're covering a lot of ground, and you might not have the word count to talk about them all fully in enough depth. A different approach might be to be more selective. Just choose 2 or 3 themes or points of comparison and compare and contrast both of your topics on just those themes. In this case, our themes could be judging the quality of information, problem solving, and creativity as themes 1, 2, and 3. So in the first half of the essay, we could discuss the role of critical thinking as it appears in our 3 chosen themes in higher education. Then we move on to do the same for the workplace in the second half of the essay, looking at the role of critical thinking according to those 3 themes or points. But have we actually compared and contrasted? The 2 halves of the essay don't really talk to each other. They feel separate. You've written 2 separate essays. We'd need a third section in which we bring them together and answer the question, yes, but how are they similar and how are they different? And you could do that, but you might find that you're starting to repeat yourself and go in circles. Remember that thing I said in the first half? Well, it's different to that thing I said in the second half. It's frustrating. A different way to organise a compare and contrast essay is by your chosen themes, the aspects which you've chosen to look at in order to decide whether critical thinking is the same or different in higher education and in the workplace. Let's take our first theme, judging the quality of information. In this first section of the essay, we briefly outline how critical thinking works, firstly in higher education, and then look at how it works in the workplace according to just judging the quality of information. And at that point, we'd be able to say directly whether they're more similar or more different in that respect. We'd then move on to the second theme, problem solving, first in higher education, then in the workplace, and again directly make that judgment, are they more similar or more different, and so on. In the conclusion then, all we'd have to do is look at those 3 sets of decisions, more similar or more different in each case, and come to an overall decision. There's much less scope for repetition. Okay, let's look at another open question. In what ways, or how, is critical thinking applied in higher education? Well, it's up to you how many ways you can think of and have the word count to talk about, but it's basically a list. But how do you structure it? Well, here you could draw on that old structural principle of moving from more important ones to slightly less important ones, and finally things that aren't as important but are still worth mentioning. If they're really not important at all, you'd probably leave them out. Pick the top ones. You've got to be selective. You could organise them from less important to more important, but it would read a bit strangely. Another open question. How can critical thinking be taught effectively at university? Now, this could be a question which has the answer in a number of ways and be structured the same as our previous question, from the most effective to the least effective way. But you could also interpret this question as a problem-solving one, asking you to make a recommendation. In that case, we're moving from descriptive to analytical and evaluative, moving up that scale of higher order thinking. We start with describing one way to teach critical thinking, then we analyse how and why that works, and then we finish by asking how well it works. We might want to repeat that structure for each way to teach critical thinking that you want to talk about, or you might really want to go in depth on just one way to teach critical thinking for the whole essay. The balance needs to be towards the top two levels of thinking: analysis, why and how, and evaluation, how well, rather than spending too much time on describing, which is easy, lower level thinking. So again, your essay structure doesn't have to be symmetrical and balanced with the same amount of words for each section. It can be unbalanced with more words given to the top levels, which will give you the higher marks. There are lots of other different types of essay question, of course, some of which are about exploring the different perspectives of an argument, some analysing case studies, some are more straightforward linear explanations of how something works, like this example. But hopefully, having covered some of the main ones that you might encounter, you've got an idea of how to apply this strategy and the range of structure types that you could use. So that's one way to think about how to structure an essay. Think about the type of question you've been given and what kind of answer it demands, and then what kind of shape of answer would work best as a structure. You might even want to sketch it out in diagram form, as I've done here, so you can get a clear sense of the shape before the actual content of the points that you want to make starts to obscure it.